Welcome to the Speed Reading 101 podcast brought to you by the IRIS organization. I'm Paul Novak, the founder of IRIS, and on the line with me is Joe Rodriguez. Hey, Joe.
How's it going, Paul?
Great. Joe, you want to introduce yourself?
All right, I'll do that. My name is Joe Rodriguez, and I am an instructor for the IRIS organization. I also recently started up my new speed reading blog. It's over at speedreadingzone.com. And I've been with IRIS for about a year now, teaching part-time the weekend classes. I'm mainly, my main core business is technology, so I do read a lot for technology, keeping up to date with everything that's going on, all that kind of stuff. I've been in technology for about 10 years and been running my own technology-based businesses for the last 2 years, so a lot of reading, and been studying speed reading for about 10 years. So Paul came up to me, introduced me to the IRIS organization, and asked me if I was interested in teaching these classes, which was actually brought on initially by my friend Mike. You remember Mike, don't you? He was the guy that introduced me to the speed reading classes. He was one of the original instructors outside of you in Toronto, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give people some an idea of where we're broadcasting from, I am broadcasting from Chicago, where IRIS is based. We're right across the street from the Chicago Board of Trade. And Joe is broadcasting today from Toronto, where he teaches most of the classes. And like some of our other instructors, we teach, IRIS teaches these classes in currently 21 cities in the U.S. and abroad. If you're looking for the schedule for the classes, you can go to irisreading.com. And again, Joe's blog at speedreadingzone.com gives you more details on speed reading. And what we're going to do, Joe, let's give the listeners an idea of what we're going to be doing on a weekly basis. We're going to start off this podcast as a once-a-week kind of thing, and we'll keep it kind of casual. We'll also plan to answer people's questions, so feel free to leave comments. And I think one of the things we'll talk about speed reading and everything really related. To me, I think of speed reading as kind of in the broader theme of managing information overload. I feel a lot of people are overcome by just way too much to read. How do you feel about that, Joe?
Yeah, I agree with that. Speed reading over the last maybe 10, 20 years, and you probably have more of a history on speed reading, was more about reading speed. And you can get your speeds up to a certain point with when you learn how to speed read. But there's also a lot of information out there, so it's also about reading strategy nowadays. So speed reading has kind of evolved into reading strategy also. So normally when we think of speed reading, we think of reading faster. But we also want to think of comprehension, retention, and also reading strategies to make sure that we're reading the right information that's valuable to us. And this obviously I'm talking to more if you're reading nonfiction and reading for career and business or technology, because that's kind of why I do a lot of reading. But I guess it also applies to leisure also, right? And
you know what? If I could just chime in, it's not just you brought up a good point about speed reading strategy and comprehension. It's not just about reading faster, but it's also about your level of focus, because a lot of people, if you're going 200 words per minute, which is the average reading speed, or if you're going 300 words a minute, or 400, or 500, or let's say you're going 1,000 words a minute, if you can't focus, your comprehension is going to be zero at any speed. So a lot of this has to do with also training ourselves to focus a little more. And if we can focus a little better, that's going to help out our speed, but that's also going to help out our comprehension.
Yeah, that's one of the big things today, because we are in a multitasking society. And if any of you guys out there follow the work of Peter Drucker, I follow a lot of his work, and multitasking is not the best thing to do if we're trying to get stuff done, and it especially doesn't serve us well when we're reading. Now, there's actually a lot of spillover from the multitasking that we do before we get into reading, or just multitasking in general outside of reading. What happens is when we read, we actually have those processes going on, looking for other bits of information, all that kind of stuff, and interrupts us while we read, and that causes us to lose focus, and thus we're not getting the most out of reading. So yeah, focus is one of the big things that we should be working on, and we do cover a lot of, and actually we should cover some of those techniques and strategies that we talk about in our classes in this podcast to zone you back into reading. Because when you focus, when you dedicate chunks of time to reading, you're going to get way more out of it.
Absolutely. And let's talk about our first question here that we had kind of set up ahead of time was, first of all, why pursue speed reading? Because some people will say, Joe, this is something I hear commonly from some people. Why should I do speed reading? I like to enjoy my material. I don't want to go through it faster. Why would anyone want to go through material faster? I know this is kind of obvious, but some people ask me this question. I think it kind of refers to fiction, but do you want to comment on that? Why would somebody want to? Why would this be useful to someone, or who would it be useful to?
Again, it's also about comprehension and retention, right? So if you read with a certain strategy, if you read in a certain way, you will notice that your speeds will go up, but you'll comprehend and retain that information better. Now, the perfect example I like to give for this is based on my own personal experience. I enjoy reading Malcolm Gladwell books. And I remember reading The Tipping Point in one sitting. I just sat down, and it was such a good book. It was such a good read, and I just went through that entire book in one sitting, like a 10, 20-minute break here and there, but essentially the whole book. And now, mind you, he's a great writer, and his stuff's written really well. But when you have an ability to read faster, the information comes at you at a faster pace. It almost feels like there's a movie playing in your head, right? So the entire book, piece of material that you read, it just flows a lot better. So I actually find it to be a more enjoyable experience now that I have the ability to read faster than before when I was when I didn't have this ability.
That's a really good point, because one of the things that I think about with speed reading, sometimes you do want to go slowly. For example, if you're reading poems, there's no reason to speed read that. Every single word is important. Or if you're reading something that's very poetically written. But with novels, sometimes you have a novel, let's say like George Orwell's Animal Farm, where it's written straightforward, modern-day English, and I would prefer to fly through that. Now, if I'm reading something by Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, well, he writes a little differently, and the enjoyment that you get out of that is by going more slowly and enjoying how he uses the language. Now, if I'm reading a textbook, well, I don't care about language. I'm just trying to get my information and be done with it. So a lot of people do mention, okay, well, what will this kind of decrease my enjoyment of reading? I think it would increase your enjoyment of reading. For me, I enjoy reading much more if I could get through a lot more information in a lot less time and actually be able to not only read the information, but to act on that information. To me, that's a very enjoyable experience.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point there, because it all depends what you're reading for. If you're reading to get an information so you can integrate it into your life, for example, your career, or if you're reading for studies, you wanna be able to take in that information better, more efficiently, and then move on to more information. Because the faster you can take in information and integrate it, the more success or more of the good results you're going to get.
Absolutely. One of the things I want to talk about here is what is speed reading's been around it didn't come out last week. It's not something brand new. It's actually been around since the 60s and 70s, I think, is when it first started getting popularized. A lot of people maybe outside of my generation would remember Evelyn Wood. Evelyn Wood, Reading Dynamics, was a program that was, she was popular for kind of first developing a methodology of teaching people to read faster. And it was really popular around the 60s and 70s because John F. Kennedy had taken a speed reading class with her, and she kind of developed this methodology to teach people to read faster. But I remember when I was first looking into speed reading, I had a professor in college that told me he suggested I should take a speed reading class. Now, I looked into it, and I kept running into the name Evelyn Wood, but I couldn't find any Evelyn Wood classes around. And part of the reason was she passed away in the early 90s, and her program, it just kind of disappeared, and there weren't any live classes that I could find. And actually, this professor ended up teaching me to speed read, which is how I learned. But it's kind of evolved since then. If you think about one of the things that we do here at Iris, it's not just about reading faster in physical material like a book or a magazine. One of the things that we take into account is a lot of people are reading a ton on the computer screen. So there's this, what is the future of speed reading, if you want to think about it? Actually, the future is already here. People, in the 60s and 70s when speed reading was getting popular, how many people were reading on a computer screen? How many people had to worry about keeping up with Facebook updates, Twitter updates, checking their email? You've really got a ton of different types of reading available. And Joe, if you want to comment on, how do you spend most of your time reading? Because I know you're not just reading every single day in a physical book.
No, I actually spend 98% or 99% of the time, I'm being specific here, most of my time here reading online, especially since I started this blog. So one of the things I do is I go and check out the other blogs that are out there, and there's a ton of blogs out there, a ton of great information, especially in the technology realm as well as the business realm, stuff that I'm interested in. So I spend a lot of time reading blogs, blog posts, and also for the technology stuff, I do white papers and that kind of stuff.
And, I want to mention there's a really interesting type of technology that people can use to actually read faster on the computer screen. If you do a ton of reading online, like Joe and myself do, this is actually a really, really useful app because, first of all, the researchers have looked at how do people read online versus on the page. And they find that people read more slowly on the computer screen. For most of us, I don't think this is a big shocker. A lot of us would prefer to read on the printed page if we could. Yep. But it's not always practical, right, Joe?
I actually find that I read faster, maybe because growing up with reading more on the computer, I wasn't really much of a reader in school. I took up reading more after school.
Okay.
Yeah, so I find that I can actually read faster on a computer.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I find with some of my students who are like that, they have been reading predominantly on the computer. They actually read faster.
That's interesting because most people will read more slowly on the computer screen because of the glare, the distractions, ads that might be blinking, or not to mention personal distractions. Sometimes I'm halfway through an article and I'm thinking about checking my email or something random pops up and I want to open up a new tab and
some pop-up ads.
Exactly. So I want to talk about an app that Iris has created called the Accelerator, and you can check this out. It's a completely free app that you can use right off the bat. It's at accelerator.com. That's spelled ACCELA, and then the word reader.com. What it allows you to do, basically, let's say you have an article on your screen, or maybe it's a PDF. You highlight the material that you want to read. You copy and paste it into this application. And then what you can do is you can set your reading speed. How fast do you want to go? Maybe you want to go 300 words a minute or more. And then how many words do you want to see at a time? And when you press play, the words will start blinking on the screen at the speed that you set. Maybe you set 2 words or 3 words at a time. But this application, the Accelerator, is a great way to get an immediate boost out of your reading speed.
Yeah, right off the bat. In fact, if you've never taken any speed reading classes before and even looked up any speed reading related information and how to read faster, if you start using Accelerator, you will notice right away you could read at a higher speed, and the reason is because your eye's not moving back and forth. Now, that's actually one of the things that we talk about in our classes, about the eyes moving back and forth and the speed. And it was actually how I got introduced into speed reading, because I used a software a while back called IQ, which gets you to train your eyes to move faster, all that kind of stuff. But your eyes don't have to move across the screen when you use Accelerator.
Right. And one of the nice things about Accelerator, a lot of people will find themselves having better comprehension because they're only focusing in one part of the screen. The words are blinking in just one area. You don't have to be, scrolling down, running into ads and things like that. And again, like Joe mentioned, there's a number of speed reading software programs out there, and a lot of them use this type of technology, the same technology that Accelerator is based on. They'll use the same kind of technology that blinks words on the screen. It's actually called there's an acronym for it called RSVP. It stands for Rapid Serial Visual Presentation. That type of technology is used in a wide variety of speed reading software programs, and Iris actually offers it for free. Again, if you go to accelerator.com, ACCELA reader.com, you can check it out right there. But again, like Joe mentioned, it's a great way to get an immediate boost out of your reading speed. It's also a great practice tool if you're trying to learn how to read faster.
Yep, and I use that for when I read my blog posts too. I used to use it a lot more before, but now I find I use it maybe about 25% of the time. But really when I want to amp up the speed, if I've got, I try to do a certain amount of reading a day to stay up to date. And if I feel like I'm lagging behind, I'll throw in all the text in Accelerator and away I go.
And I also want to talk about, Joe, reading as an exercise in productivity, because it's not just how much reading you're doing. It's also about, are you doing reading that's actually important to you? And I kind of think of it this way. To me, as an entrepreneur and a business owner, I'm constantly trying to read things that are going to improve my business, improve my life. And if I'm just reading, I could spend 3 hours reading the news every single day. It's not an effective use of my time, but just because I've read that much, if I'm reading 8 hours a day, it's not really, you can get into bad habits with reading. You could end up I think you could end up reading too much, and you could be very ineffective. I don't know what your take on that is.
Yeah, definitely. So, being the kind of person that reads a lot of blog posts, I subscribe to the blogs that I'm interested in, and they're very niche blogs on specific topics. And that's how I do my filtering of reading. I just stick with certain sources, and I think that's important because there's a ton of information out there on the web.
Right.
So
it's kind of like you as a blogger, and you've got your blog at speedreadingzone.com. If you were to just read all day, every single day, for the rest of the week, you wouldn't get much writing done for your blog, would you?
No. No, and
you'd have a lot of information, but sharing it wouldn't really be an option.
And even though I'm a speed reader, I'm not a speed writer or speed typer or anything like that. So it takes me a while to churn out a blog post, but I'm getting better at it now. I recently found that I really do enjoy writing and putting all this information down. So yeah, there's got to be a certain level of time put aside for writing, and I can't just keep reading all the information out there. So what I try to do is, as far as my reading goes, especially now with this blog, is I segment a large portion of the reading time towards researching speed reading related information, and also information. A chunk of that time is spent on actual blogging, on how to get more traffic to your blog, information that other bloggers have and experiences in blogging, all that kind of stuff. There's a whole different world on blogging, and I'm sure there's a ton of podcasts and out there talking about that subject. So that's how I kind of do it. I mean, you really have to segment your time because, you could just go out and read everything. So it all depends what your goal is. So I think it's very important when you're reading that you lay out your strategy. You say, okay, well, this is the area of my life that I want to focus on. I want to get information on. And again, this is more geared towards, it's like a theme going on this podcast. It's more geared towards personal development and growth in your career. But that's a big part of my life, personal development and career growth. So I do segment what I read largely to that. And you know what? I hardly ever read any gossip or that kind of stuff. I'm just not really interested. But you can easily get consumed by that too, right? So it's all about where is your time best spent.
Yeah, and you know what? When you say getting consumed by information, I've found myself, numerous times over the past few years, getting caught up sometimes, turning into a news junkie. So I really do love reading, and I do a lot of my reading on the computer screen. And like you mentioned, you could spend your entire day just reading the news, reading blogs, reading tons of different things. And I would find myself sometimes spending, let's say a big news item hit the wires, and there's breaking news, and I'm spending an hour and a half, 2 hours on this, when really all I needed to spend was 15 minutes getting the scoop, and then I should be, getting back to work and, being productive. But sometimes it's very easy to, I think, read too much.
You know what? And that's kind of the side effect. It's like I guess it's kind of a little bit of a negative side effect that you can get when you have the ability to read faster. Because the kind of speed reading we talk about, our formula in the IRIS speed reading organization, is based on not only being able to read faster, but efficiently reading. So you actually don't feel as tired, and you can actually read a lot more information. So the side effect is that if you have that ability to read faster and you can take in information more efficiently, you're just going to go on a rampage and just read a lot. So that kind of becomes one of those things.
Absolutely. And another thing I want listeners and people to think about is, when was the last time you actually learned how to read? I always think about it, for most people, the last time they learned how to read was like kindergarten or first grade, when they first learned how to read. That was a long time ago. And what were we reading, back then? It was probably something like Dr. Seuss, The Cat in the Hat, basic reading material. You're probably not reading that kind of material anymore. You probably have more technical information to read. A lot of people that come to our classes, they're college students or professionals, and they have really tough they have a lot of material, and it's also technical. So one of the things I think, one of the drive behind our organization is to get these advanced level reading skills out to more people, because most people, the last time they learned how to read, unfortunately, was the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and the way we learn how to read is very interesting, right? Teacher or our parents ask us to read out loud, and then once they feel we're comprehending or we're understanding the information, they ask us to read in our head, and that never gets revisited, and we move on to more and more complex material. Now that reading style that we're taught serves us well up to a certain point, but once our vocabulary starts to grow and we have good command of the English language, and we move on to more complex material, there is a point where you plateau.
Right, absolutely, and also there's this area. It's not just about reading faster. We always talk about. It's also about our comprehension, and comprehension is a tricky little subject, because some people feel comprehension and retention are the same thing. So what you remember and what you comprehend are similar. They're actually two separate skills. Comprehension is what you're understanding the moment you're actually reading it, and retention is what you remember later on. And for example, you could have great comprehension and absolutely terrible retention. You could forget it in a minute or the next day. And we see this all the time. So one of the things we focus on in our classes is to work on both comprehension and retention. It's also something kind of tricky to measure. I think a lot of people, we've all taken like a standardized test before where you have a passage to read and questions to answer. And a lot of people think that measures comprehension. It doesn't really measure your comprehension. It actually asks you, what do you remember from the passage that you just read? And it's also kind of testing you, how fast can you find the answer? Think about, I remember we were doing this, one of our speed reading classes in one of the public schools in Chicago, one of the high schools. And we had this one student who had taken a standardized test before taking our class, and he was labeled as a below average reader. They told him, you're a below average reader because you scored a 50% on this standardized reading test. They told him he had terrible comprehension. Now, his score on the test, he had 50%. He had 20 out of 40 correct. Now, 20 out of 40 questions, yeah, that is 50%. But when we looked at his test a little more closely, we saw that he only answered 21 questions. And how do you feel about his comprehension now? If this person answered, 20 out of 21 correct, there's no way you could say this person has terrible comprehension. They hit, if they had time to finish the test, they could have, scored almost a perfect score. But the problem there is, this lack of speed. Sometimes, people, they've got great comprehension, but they're really, really going slowly.
Yeah, and so that's essentially what happened there. He ran out of time, right? And another thing that I notice when it comes to comprehension, as far as gauging how well you comprehend something, is the material that you're reading, right? So going back to technology stuff that I read, I'm sure, Paul, because you're not into that stuff as much as I am, if I give you some of my heavy technical material, you might have a hard time comprehending it, even if you do all the best practices to try and comprehend it. Absolutely.
Familiarity, that's definitely... Yeah. Likewise, I've got a big background working in the financial markets. I used to work at the Board of Trade, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, so I'm very familiar with, trading terminology and, stock market, commodity market, currency market, all of that stuff. That I can speak that language. But if you give it to someone that isn't familiar with it, it's going to be a little tougher for them.
Yeah, and if you test us on it, we'll fail the test. So it's got a lot to do with the information that you have in your head before you start reading that material, also, right? And your experiences, like everything is connected, right? We're talking the emotions, past experiences, perceptions, judgments, all that kind of stuff it plays a role when you read, and it does play a role on comprehension, and also plays a role on retention too, because I will retain something longer if it really piques my interest.
Well, you brought up a really good point about your experiences and how that plays a role in your comprehension. It actually makes me think of the book Animal Farm by George Orwell, and it's a political satire, and essentially it's just a story about animals. But if you know when it was written, I think it was written around like 1947. If you're familiar with what's going on, I think it's at the end of World War II, at the onset of the Cold War. Think about the comprehension that two people would have. Let's say you gave that book to someone that's in third grade. A kid in third grade is going to be able to read that, and they'll get comprehension. They'll understand what the novel is about. And you could say they have full comprehension. Now, what if you gave that same book to someone that's maybe 30, 40, or 50 years old, someone that knows a little more about history? They don't have the same comprehension, but they still have comprehension. It's just a different type of comprehension because of their experience, because of their knowledge of history. They'll be able to make the connections between, what's going on with Soviet communism and things like that. Yep.
So I think it's fair to say then it's not something we can accurately gauge comprehension.
I would argue actually that comprehension is absolutely impossible to objectively measure. Now, your reading speed, you can objectively measure that. You read for a minute, and you count up every single word that you read during that minute, and that is an objective words per minute. You can't argue with it. Now, comprehension, if I Joe, if you just read something right now and I give you a test and you scored 80% on it, what exactly does that mean? It's not an objective measure, and some people forget that.
Yeah. So what we focus on then is taking in that information and understanding in a way that it relates to you, right? Absolutely. So that's the goal. So I guess we kind of went way off there on this whole comprehension thing, but it's very important. It's very important to know that. Let's take it back a little bit. Let's talk about because I'm sure the readers, listeners out there, would love to get some tips that they could implement right away so they can increase their speed. Let's share some tips and some actual material that we talk about in our class.
Absolutely. Well, I think the simplest, and I think, Joe, you would agree with this, the simplest and most foundational thing you can do to increase your reading speed is to right off the bat start using your hand to guide your eyes. Now, you could use your hand or a pen.
That's actually my next blog post.
Okay.
So when I talked to you about earlier, I'm writing, and to get Excel Reader up, that was the one.
Right. Excel Reader is another great tool. So, I mean, if we're thinking of 2 top tips that we could share on this podcast, and we're going to be providing more on a weekly basis in this podcast.
One for online reading and one for offline reading. Use your finger for offline. So right off the top of the bat, I know there's probably some listeners out there that have never heard of that concept of using your finger, or I also like to use a pen and recommend to my students they use their pen. In fact, they probably think what most of my students think when I teach these classes, right when I introduce that concept to them, is isn't that kind of going back in time? Like, isn't that how we learned how to read in the first place? Like, we start off following with our finger?
And you know what? Some people think it's the wrong way to read, because I remember when I was little, back in kindergarten and first grade, when I was first learning how to read, I remember putting my finger on the page, and the teacher said, "Don't use your finger to read." She kind of yelled at me. It was a little bit traumatizing, Joe.
I don't know if I can remember that far back.
Well, I'm sure I wasn't, not everyone was as traumatized as I was about this, but, and not everyone was told this. One of the things that I find when I ask students, in our classes, not everyone was told this, but, sometimes we'll find like 30% of our students were told, don't use your finger to read. Now, if you asked your teacher back then, well, why not? They wouldn't have a good answer for you. Now, you wouldn't do that when you're in kindergarten. That's kind of talking.
I was taught how to read using my finger initially. Like, just, I guess, so she would see the flow, or he or she would see the flow of how we read, and then quickly it would be considered a bad habit. Like, it was kind of like a starting thing.
Interesting. And you know what? It's weird, because I guess what we're finding, just, Joe, you're telling me about your experience reading growing up, and I'm explaining mine, that, we were all taught similarly, but a little bit differently. Joe, you're mentioning you were taught use your finger initially and then don't do it later. For me, I was told, don't use your finger. And I never see anybody using their hand or their finger or a pen to guide their eyes. So it's kind of thought that maybe that's not the right way to read, or it's...
Maybe I was the only one taught that way, and that teacher doesn't teach anymore.
We need more teachers like that. And that's part of the reason Iris is doing these classes. By the way, a little plug for Iris, 21 cities in the U.S. Get into a class. We'll teach you how to use your hand. Actually, you don't need to. You can listen to this podcast right now, and you're learning it right away. Here's why using your hand is important. Because I know we're talking about whether or not we're taught this way, but using your hand is important because your eyes are naturally attracted to motion. When you point to something, you're calling attention to it with your eyes. And it's a very easy way, actually, to improve your focus. So some people, what they find is while they're using their hand to guide their eyes, they actually feel like their comprehension's a little better, too. Not only are they going faster, but they can understand it better because they're a little better focused.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? Even before I learned of this technique as being one of the key techniques for being able to read faster, I was using that when I read in places like on the subway, for example. There's a lot of noise. Right? It's hard to maintain focus. Unconsciously, automatically, you grab your finger and you start using it to dictate the flow of how you're reading and pull in your focus. So yes, a great tip. But how do we do it properly? Because you know what? This is the first thing that I get asked when I share this, because this is the biggest thing that I share with everyone who says, oh, you teach you speed reading classes. What's the one thing I can do right now? I say, use your finger. How do we properly use our finger so we can get the speed out of it? And what's the proper way of doing it?
Well, I would say, to start, you want to be going from left to right, margin to margin, following your finger or a pen. And the reason why we say go left to right, a lot of times when people see or they think about speed reading, they think about someone just, moving their hand down the page and just like grabbing tons of words.
You'll get there eventually.
Exactly. You're not going to start there. But it's just like, when you see, a few years ago, I used to, I've always been very interested in the tango as a dance. I haven't been much of a dancer, but the tango has always fascinated me. And I remember the first lesson that I went to a couple of years ago, you see the instructors and they're doing all these tricks and things like that. And I wanted to learn how to do that. I'm like, show me how to do that one move. That looks really, really cool. And lesson one was just walking. And I was thinking to myself, well, I know how to walk. I didn't really know how to walk for dancing the tango, but you have to kind of go step by step. So, running your hand down the line and just grabbing huge groups of words is not really the way you're going to start off. Mm-hmm. You might like to start off that way, but it's kind of like baby steps. So, initially you go from left to right, line by line.
And you want to go underneath the word, right? You don't want to cover the word while you're reading. So it's left to right, and we want to hover or drag our finger. What do you think's better?
You could do it either way. I think it's easier for people to drag it. Yeah. Usually dragging it across the line. Now, this is actually a problem when you have something like an iPad, right? If you're reading books on the iPad and you drag your finger, you're flipping a page.
But luckily, there's more RSVP apps like Accelerator that are coming out. In fact, if you guys go out there and grab the Globe and Mail app on the iPhone, there is a RSVP technology embedded in there, so you could read. You could go out there and read articles or news in that same format with as Accelerator. So it's picking up.
And by the way, Accelerator, we're actually in the process of planning to create an Accelerator app for the iPhone, for the iPad, and the Android operating systems.
That's great news. I didn't even know about that.
Well, now you know.
And we talk all day about speed reading. Okay, so again, let's recap. You want to drag your finger from left to right underneath the line that you're reading, and your area of focus is going to be just above the tip of your finger, or if you're using a pen, which you can use it also, is focus right at the tip and focus on the word, and then just kind of go line to line like that. Once you get better at it, and we'll talk more about this in another podcast, you can take in chunks of words, because we do have that ability with our peripheral vision to take in chunks of words. So let's actually, why do you feel, Paul, that it's better to use the pen? Because I'll tell you personally that the focus is number one, right? It keeps our focus. Number two is regression, going back and reading the same stuff over and over again.
Well, a good example of that is, if I could just chime in here, sometimes you have really, really long lines. I think about, when you're reading a newspaper, usually the columns and the lines are very, very narrow. You might have like 3, 4, 5 words per line. But let's say you're reading a textbook or a novel, you might have like 12 words per line or 20 words per line. All of us have had this experience, I think, when you ever read to the end of a line and then you accidentally reread that same line. All of us have kind of done this at one point or another, and if you're using your hand, it's not going to happen as often because you know where you are.
And that's what regression is, going back and reading the same thing. And apparently, according to studies, we do that about 33% of the time.
Yeah, that's 1 out of every 3 hours. It's like saying if you read for 3 hours, you really only got 2 hours done.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So if you can get rid of regression or reduce it largely, even if you don't use any of the other techniques that we talk about in our classes, you're already by yourself a lot of time.
Yeah, you're saving yourself a lot of time, and even without improving your reading speed. Just by cutting down the amount of time that you go back to reread. And by the way, you mentioned 33% of the time. That's based on medium-level material, something that's not too easy and it's not too hard. Guess what happens when someone's got to read something really technical? Maybe it's advanced level physics or engineering. That number for regression, the amount of time we go back to reread, it goes way up because it's more technical material.
Yeah, that's right. So there is techniques and strategies that we're going to talk about in later podcasts. We're going to be sharing like a ton of information in these upcoming podcasts, zoning in on regression, and the big one, which we'll just kind of touch on a little bit, which is auditory reassurance or subvocalization or reading in your head, the big one.
Yeah, saying words in your head, or hearing that voice in your head. If you're hearing voices in your head, it doesn't mean you're crazy. That's, most people when they're reading, they're saying words in their head. That's how we were taught. Stop saying the words out loud and say them in your head instead. So in a future podcast, we'll actually cover some tips on reducing subvocalization, because that's another great way to improve your reading speed.
And then that again goes back to how we were taught how to read in the first place, right? Because
Absolutely.
We read out loud, and then we read in our head, and we continue reading in our head. So that's what subvocalization is. And the good news is we can actually comprehend, despite if we reduce comprehension, if we reduce subvocalization or auditory reassurance, we can still comprehend, and actually comprehend better.
Well, I like to mention as an example of that, because some people will say, well, I feel like I can't, I feel like it's absolutely necessary to say a word to understand it. And I'll ask them, okay, when you're driving and you see a stop sign, do you actually say stop in your head? It doesn't happen. Usually you see a stop sign and you know that it says stop. It's just, you see it and you know it. It registers right away. So, this habit of saying words in your head, or as Joe mentioned, this habit is called auditory reassurance. It's also known as subvocalization. This is something that we really want to change. And again, we'll talk about how to go about changing that in a future podcast.
Okay.
But we've covered a lot of ground here, I think, in our first podcast.
Start off by using a pen, or if you're reading online, using Accelerator.
Absolutely.
And that should get you a good start. Also, one more thing I forgot to mention about when you use a pen or use your finger is you can vary your speed and push yourself to read a little faster, so make your finger move a little faster. And here's what I found, based on the feedback that I get from my students, is we already have that ability to read about 20% faster, which will become apparent when you push yourself a little bit with your finger to move your finger faster than you would normally read. You'll actually find that you're going to be reading that information at that speed that you push your finger faster at, and you'll retain that information, comprehend it about 20%, I would say. So right away, on average, if you use your finger when you're reading or a pen, you will see an increase in about 20%.
Yeah, it's actually a very simple way to get that immediate boost in your reading speed.
So right away, just from listening to this podcast, you've increased your speed by 20%. So I encourage you to go out and try it.
Exactly. People have got to go out and try to do it. We're going to be wrapping things up here. So one of the things, if you have some time to spend reading today, definitely make sure you're using your hand or a pen. If you're doing your reading online, check out that Accelerator application. Again, it's at accelerator.com, and it's spelled ACCELA, and then the word reader.com. And also check out Joe's blog on speed reading at speedreadingzone.com. Any other things, Joe, you want to mention before we sign off here?
We forgot about our special promo for the listeners that we've got going on this month.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, okay. So we got a special promo for all the listeners of this podcast that's going to be valid for this month, the month of August 2011. And this is the promo. So right now we've got our classes going on for $199. What do they get for $199?
For $199 is the one-day 5-hour session, which covers not only improving your speed, but also your comprehension and retention, covers all the course materials, and that's a class in any of the cities that we're currently in right now. And it's 21 in the U.S. And also Toronto in Canada. So
we've got classes going on in 21 different cities in the U.S. So there's a city around you close by, or the city that you live in that has a workshop going up. Just go over to irisreading.com and click on the city, and you will see the upcoming schedule. So here's the promo. $199 is our 5-hour workshop, and it is a workshop. So we do a lot of drills, a lot of exercises. We cover the entire iris speed reading formula, iris speed reading method. What kind of results do students get out of it? I personally noticed that it's not uncommon for students to at least double their reading speed.
Yeah, typically, depending on where someone's starting out, they end up going anywhere from 2 to 3 times faster, and that's with better comprehension.
Yeah, with better comprehension and a better retention too. Students that read a lot for their careers, or students that just tend to read a lot in general, will be the biggest ones to benefit from it, because it's kind of like we cover a lot of strategies and how to remove bad habits, reading bad habits. When we remove those layers, those friction points that's causing us to read slower, you immediately see a jump. So they're great workshops, and I personally teach, as Paul mentioned, the workshops in Toronto, along with 2 other great instructors. And here's our promo. Okay, so when you go out and pick up or book one of our classes, at the checkout, if you enter this promo code, speedreadingzone.com, that's SPEEDREADINGZONE.com as the promo code, you will get an additional 25% off of the class. And Google checkout's kind of weird, right? So you've got
to basically put in this promo code after you enter the credit card information, and so it won't. Some people get a little confused, I think, on the screen when it says $199 and you've got to enter your information. After you hit continue, you'll eventually get to a screen that says, okay, here's the confirmation. Are you sure you want to buy? And do you have a promo code? At that point, you could type in that coupon code, which is speedreadingzone.com. And again, it's going to give you 25% off the cost of the class. And if my mathematics is correct, it's about $50 off a $199 class.
Yeah, and all thanks for listening to this podcast.
Absolutely.
And in celebration for this podcast, too, because we're going to be doing these, as Paul mentioned, on a weekly basis. And we're going to be covering various topics in the realm of speed reading. So make sure that you subscribe to this podcast and stay up to date.
Absolutely. And I always tell people in my classes, and I'm going to tell them here, if you like what we're doing here at Iris, and if you like this podcast, please tell your friends. And if you didn't like it, tell your enemies.
And also, questions, feedback, all that kind of stuff, welcome. We will take that. We'll take any questions and answer them on the podcast.
Absolutely. And you know what, Joe, what we're going to do? We're going to set up a phone number on the next podcast. We don't have it ready right now, but we'll set up a phone number where you can, we'll accept voicemails, and anyone that's got a question, you can call in, and we'll actually play your questions on the podcast. And we'll also answer your questions on the podcast. So tune in for the next podcast next week, and we're going to have that number for you. You could also add your, on Joe's blog or on the Iris site, or even through iTunes. You can post your questions. We'll keep track of them, and we'll plan to answer them as well.
Yep, great. And again, take advantage of that special promo offer, 25% off. Enter the code speedreadingzone.com.
And that's when you register at irisreading.com.
Okay. And the schedules are posted there. So, So thank you for taking the time to listen to our podcast. Hope you got some great, valuable information and tips to get you started to reading faster. It is our goal to help you read faster and get your comprehension and retention up also.
Thank you all for listening, and have a great day.